As we talk about ethics and spirituality, I want to just mention in particular Stephen, who on Thursdays, when we've had our question time, has often brought with him a number of interesting and stimulating talks and links and information. And it just so happens that a number of the things that he's brought with him over the last few weeks has suited very nicely for what I wanted to talk about today. So I'm going to begin with some of that information. Stephen shared with us about the philosopher, the well-known philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche was an atheist, but he talks about the way that Christianity has certain advantages when it comes to talking about morality and establishing what morality and ethics are. So this is quoting from one of those pages. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche was a famous critic of Christianity and thought that it needed to be transcended by modern men and women. But at the same time, he granted that there were some advantages to the Christian understanding of morality, advantages that were no longer operative in a more relativistic, nihilistic, post-Enlightenment world. I'm not going to share with you those advantages. It happens. You're going to have to look that up yourself later, and I will provide the link if you are interested in doing so. But that particular article does end with these questions. What is the ultimate metaphysical foundation of those moral standards then? How does one justify holding on to them and recommending them to others? And how do we know what is good and what is bad? And who determines it? Now, I've also recently, again thanks to Stephen, looked at this debate that you can find on YouTube. Again, I'll provide that link if you're interested in watching it. It's an hour and a half long, so it takes a good while to get through, but it is a very entertaining and interesting debate that goes on. So we have two gentlemen, Glenn Scrivener on the left there, who provides the perspective from the Christian point of view, and Matt Dillahunty, who provides an atheist point of view. He describes himself as a secular humanist. And where I think this debate gets to, and what I think we can see by watching this take place, is this. The existence of God would provide a solid foundation for morality. But if God does not exist, or indeed where there is doubt that he exists, morality becomes somewhat more changeable and less certain. So, for example, they talk about the idea of the intrinsic value of human life. If one accepts a Christian worldview, then human life has an intrinsic value. If, however, you accept the secular humanist point of view, there is no intrinsic value in human life. It's valuable because we value it, but that's the only reason. So these two gentlemen represent two different ways of approaching morality. If I talk about Glenn, who represents the Christian side, we really find it encapsulated in what we've read this morning from Deuteronomy chapter 5. And it's these words of the Lord, "Oh, that they had such a heart in them, that they would fear me and always keep all my commandments, that it might be well with them and with their children forever." As opposed to Matt, who represents secular humanism. And this is as close as I can, kind of stitching together what Matt said in this debate. Morality is evaluating the consequences of our actions with respect to the goal of human well-being, the foundation of which is an agreement on what that foundation is. Now you can see that these are contradictory points of view, contradictory positions. On the one hand, does ethics exist by divine command, or does it exist by agreement? Now what I want to do today is respond to all of this from a Swedenborgian point of view. What do we read in Swedenborg? So I want to look at four things. First of all, guiding principles. Then I want to ask, is morality or is ethics changing or unchanging? I want to look at our tendency to narrow our definition of brotherhood and sisterhood and our need to expand it. And I want to ask finally, does benefit or reward provide an adequate foundation for our morality? So we'll start with those guiding principles. Now if you read Swedenborg, he's very clear that law is derived from the spiritual world and indeed from the Lord. This passage comes from Doctrine of Life, paragraph 53, and it's headed, "The Ten Commandments tell us which evils are sins." And he says this, "Is there any society anywhere on the globe that does not know that it is evil to steal, commit adultery, murder, and bear false witness? If they did not know this, and if they were not prevented by laws from doing these things, it would be all over for them, because any community or republic or kingdom would collapse if it did not have these laws. Could anyone presume that the Israelite nation was so much more stupid than everyone else that they did not know these things were evil? So we might wonder why these laws, so well known over the whole face of the earth, were made public by Jehovah himself from Mount Sinai in such a miraculous fashion. But the truth is that they were made public in such miraculous fashion to let Israel know that these laws are not merely civil and moral, but are spiritual laws as well, and that breaking them is not only harmful to our fellow citizens and communities, but is also a sin against God. So the proclamation of these laws from Mount Sinai by Jehovah made them laws of religion, as something that needs to be done for his sake and for the sake of our own salvation. In Secrets of Heaven, he writes this, "The cause of all the laws laid down for the children of Israel lies in heaven, and the laws of order there are the origin from which they spring. The laws of order in heaven all spring from divine truth and goodness, which emanate from the Lord." And so Swedenborg's understanding is that truth and goodness from the Lord manifest itself in spiritual laws that exist in the heavens, and they in turn manifest themselves in the laws we have in the external world. Now, I'll take the Golden Rule as an example of this. Swedenborg writes, "The reason why the Golden Rule was given to the children of Israel was that a similar law exists in the spiritual world. For good done with all one's heart carries its own reward together with it, and evil done with all one's heart carries its own punishment together with it." It's an interesting concept there, you see, because we're not talking actually about a divine decree. We're talking about this law operates because this is the way the world works. It's kind of more like the law of gravity than it is the civil laws that we have and we call laws today in modern society. Is there an absolute definition of goodness and truth. You see, this is where this debate differs. It's where the disagreement between religion and atheism exists. The religious say that there is a God and therefore there is an absolute truth. The atheists say that there is not. Now the thing is that none of us can conceive of a universe in which both of those positions are actually true. So one or the other must be true, and the other one that's not true must be false. But what we can do is we can conceive of a universe in which there are a number of people who adhere to one or to the other premise. There are those within our world who believe in God, and there are those within our world who do not. And we can understand that they might be adhering to different moral or ethical codes. Now here's the problem. So here's our two gentlemen again. And what I want to do is imagine their moral code. So each circle represents the moral code of each one of these. So Glenn on the left representing the Christian perspective, Matt on the right representing the secular humanist. Now, when we talk about this group of moral code, what I've called Area A, where both sides agree, there's really no problem there. So when we talk about this falls within my morality and it falls within your morality, all is well and good. Then when we talk about B, we talk about an action which lies outside of both codes of morality. Again, there's no problem here. The problem lies with areas C and D, where I believe in something as part of my moral code, but you don't. Or you believe in something as part of your moral code, but I don't. This is where the challenge lies. And now the thing about the golden rule is that it forces us to consider the morality not just of myself, but of the other. You know the code, you know the story, do unto others as you would have them do to you. Now if we talk about something very basic and simple, ice cream for example. You know, Glenn likes ice cream, so he assumes that Matt must also like ice cream. So if Glenn wants to be given ice cream, he must give ice cream to Matt. Fine if Matt likes ice cream, but there's no guarantee that Matt actually does. On that very basic level, a very external level, the golden rule doesn't work. It needs to be elevated, and it needs to be elevated into this level of morality. My level of morality, my understanding of ethics, is what I desire others to do to me. Therefore, the golden rule says, I must consider the morality of the other in the way that I deal with them. Do you see how it kind of elevates it out of and brings it to a whole different level? And so the golden rule is a very interesting example of a law which just brings a whole nother perspective to this question. I want to move on to consider whether morality is changing or unchanging. I've already referred to a couple of years ago when we were in Canberra, and I did a series of talks on the Bible for atheists. The very common objection to the Bible many atheists had was really all to do with the culture of the Bible. And of course we see that culture enshrined, as it were, within the literal text of the Bible itself. But Swedenborg's perspective on it is that the Bible is written in a way as to accommodate itself to the understanding of those for whom it was written. So, in recognizing that there is something incomprehensible about divine truth, it must be brought down to a level at which people understand it. And that necessarily takes on the culture into which it is spoken. Swedenborg calls this accommodation. Now, when we look at the laws of the Old Testament, we find examples of this. Now, Swedenborg here is talking about the what's called usury in the Bible, or charging of interest. So we find it in Exodus 22. Now, he writes this: when a man is in the interior things, this law ceases, together with other similar laws. I'm going to read in between here. For the Israelite and Jewish nation was solely in external things, which were representative of internal things. And he continues, consequently, this law was binding upon that nation at that time, but it is not binding upon Christians to whom interior things had been revealed by the Lord. And he goes on then to talk about, well, why is it still in the Bible? Why do we still read it? It's because it reflects something important about our inner spiritual journey, which needs to be remembered, although in an external level, we don't need to continue adhering to that particular law. I wonder if you remember last week we talked about the parable and the exemplary story. I wonder if you remember the difference between the two of them. So the parable was a story which talks about what heaven is like. So, the kingdom of heaven is like. And one of the examples we used was the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. There's some important lesson to be derived from that. However, we cannot say that the kingdom of heaven is a mustard seed. So in that sense, we have something that is dissimilar from heaven, which we are using to think about heaven. Now that contrasted with the exemplary story, and the exemplary story was an example of something. And one of the key ones that we all know very well is the Good Samaritan. When Jesus is approached and asked the question, who is my neighbour? Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. He is an example of the neighbour. He shows us how we ought to treat the neighbour. And so there are these two different ways of looking at the parables, and it's important that we not confuse them. Now, in Swedenborg's view, the Old Testament law is the same. There are things that are similar, and there are things that are dissimilar with spiritual principles. The golden rule, as we read, is similar. Do unto others. The idea that good carries its own reward with it, that evil carries its own punishment with it, you see, these are similar ideas. However, when we start talking about charging interest, when we start talking about rules of slavery, when we start talking about dietary laws, when we start talking about dress code, none of these things are similar to spiritual principles, you see. So we may well say the golden rule applies in the spiritual world, do unto others, that good receives its own reward, evil its own punishment. But we can't say the same thing about dietary law. We can't say the same thing about slavery. We can't say the same thing about dress code. Now it so happens Paul has the same attitude. He writes this: if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. And I believe this is what he intends here. There is spiritual law, of course, and we must adhere to that. But that is not the same as natural law. And so there's a distinction there to be made, and a very important one. I move on to our third point. Our tendency to narrow our definition of brotherhood and sisterhood and our need to expand it. Swedenborg writes this: "For everyone calls that good which from the love of his will he feels to be delightful, and he calls that truth which from the wisdom of his understanding thence derived he perceives to be pleasant." I'm going to read elsewhere in Swedenborg's work. "Forms of good and truths are either the Lord's or not the Lord's. The Lord's are those which a person puts into practice for the sake of his neighbour, his country, the church and the Lord's kingdom, thus for the sake of truth and goodness themselves, and above all for the Lord's sake. These forms of good and truths are the ones that are the Lord's, but those that are not the Lord's are the ones which a person puts into practice for the sake of himself as his end in view, and for the sake of the world as his end in view. Every form of truth or good does indeed flow in from the Lord, but when a person turns the Lord's goodness or truth directly towards himself, it becomes man's. It becomes the possession of him who turns it directly towards himself, for it becomes the good of self-love and love of the world. This is the kind of good that all evil people do to one another." The golden rule, as we've talked about a number of times already today, is an example of this expansion. We need in our morality not to withdraw and narrow our definition of who is our neighbour, who are the people that we treat well. We need to expand it, but our tendency will always be to withdraw. And this is a very important point for us to bear in mind when we consider our morality. And this is what Christianity urges us to do, to expand our view of those who are to be treated well by us. Finally, I want to ask, does benefit or reward provide an adequate foundation for morality? Here's a very interesting passage from Swedenborg. "Those who do good solely for the sake of gain in the world cannot possibly be integrated among angels, since their final objective for doing it is the world, that is, affluence and prestige, not heaven, that is, the blessedness and happiness of souls." I think we understand that. It's pretty straightforward. If you do things for yourself in a worldly way, then that's not going to get you into heaven. It's not what heaven is. However, he continues, "People, however, who do good for the sake of reward in the next life differ from those spoken about immediately above in that they have life and happiness in heaven as their final objective. But this objective turns and alters the direction of their divine worship away from the Lord towards themselves, as a consequence of which they want things to go well only for themselves, not for others, except in so far as these want the same for them. When this is so, self-love resides in their every desire, not love of the neighbour. That is, they do not have any genuine charity, nor can these people be integrated among angels, for angels utterly loathe both the word and the notion of reward or payment." So this is an interesting case. We have people who do what is good and right in the world for the sake of being saved. And Swedenborg says these people do not necessarily find their way into heaven. They are incompatible with the nature of heaven itself. He continues, the reason why the Lord says so many times that those who do good will have their reward in heaven is this. Before a person has been regenerated, he cannot help thinking about reward. But it is different once he's been regenerated. Then he is indignant if anyone thinks that he does good to his neighbour for the sake of reward, for he feels delight and bliss in the doing of good, but not in repayment. So the question is benefit or reward a good enough basis for our morality, our ethics? See, Matt Delahunty, in representing secular humanism, talks about the way that our morality is based upon what is best for humanity and what is good for us. You know, so I mentioned the intrinsic value of human life. Human life for him is good because we like it, and that's all there is to it. And his morality is based on, you know, what is good for us, what we think is good, what is best for me, essentially. And from a spiritual point of view, that's just not good enough. If I base my morality upon what is beneficial to me, there will come a point where I will stop. If we as a nation base our morality upon what is good for us, there comes a point where we will stop. It's an important beginning to base our morality on that. That is where we start. We start thinking about ourselves. But what I believe Swedenborg tells us is that that is not good enough to get us into heaven. We need to get ourselves to the point where we become the embodiment of those good principles. It's something that comes out of our inner nature. And this is the place of the Lord in our lives. So for the coming week, what I'd suggest is just to think about this idea of reward. To what extent do you have your moral code guided by reward or benefit? To what extent do you have your moral code guided by just being that quality or that moral code itself? Becoming an embodiment of what is good. Having the Lord active within your life such that you would never consider doing anything else.